Welcome back to SPED 738. In this module, we're going to take a look at working with students with hearing loss. Kind of the main objectives for this module is for you to be able to identify the characteristics of hearing loss, be able to describe some of the causes for hearing loss, and also really describe in detail some of the assessments and evaluation tools that can be used, and then we'll take a look briefly at some instructional practices and accommodations for students with hearing loss. When we look at IDEA's definition for hearing loss, they describe hearing loss in a couple ways. One is through deafness, and the other is hard of hearing. And they have definitions for both of those based on how much loss has occurred in the student's hearing. Additionally, you may hear the terms like unilateral or bilateral in terms of if the hearing loss only impacts one ear or both ears. But IDEA defines deafness as a hearing impairment that is so severe that it impairs the student's ability to process linguistic information through hearing with and without amplification, so that it affects, of course, their educational performance. That's what we're always going to get back to in terms of the IDEA definitions, is that impairment is adversely affecting their educational performance. When we look at in terms of the severity of hearing loss and measurement of the hearing loss, there's some great examples in your text about what that looks like in terms of how many decibels the child can hear. When we look at profound hearing loss and look at deafness, typically we're looking at the hearing loss around the 70 to 90 decibel mark. Hard of hearing, we'll see those kids around the 20 to 70 decibel mark. And what we know about hearing loss is that for the most part, in terms of congenital deafness, it's a very rare condition, okay, for students to be born with congenital deafness. The other thing that I think is really important to consider when we're talking about hearing loss is we're talking about a community of people who have the same impairment that are known as the deaf community, and they have very specific deaf culture related to how they interact with their deafness, their expectations of other people's understanding of their deafness, and how they view deafness. They do not view it as an impairment. And so typically what you will see the deaf community refer to a child with deafness is as a deaf child, not as a child with a hearing impairment. That word impairment is a word that they don't often use in the deaf community. In addition to that, even a student who may be hard of hearing and have some hearing loss still oftentimes will identify themselves as a deaf child or deaf person. When we look at kind of the degrees of hearing loss, from slight to profound hearing, we can see from this table that's also in your text kind of what that looks like in terms of what they can hear. So if you have a student, for example, with moderate hearing loss, which is going to be in that 40 to 55 decibel range of frequency, they're going to be able to hear conversational speech, but really only at a close distance. Group activities in a classroom are going to be a challenge because there's lots of noise going on with that. When we think about students with moderate to severe hearing loss, they are only hearing really loud, clear conversational speech. Okay, a lot of times speech to them is going to be intelligible only if they have some kind of assistance hearing, whether it's a hearing aid or an FM system to be able to pick up on that sound. As many of you know, in our house we have a child with hearing loss. Josie was born with profound hearing loss in one ear and moderate to severe in the other. So profound hearing loss for her means that she's falling in that 90 plus decibels, okay? In that ear, in her right ear, she cannot hear any conversational speech. She really doesn't hear any environmental sounds either in that ear. That ear has no sound that it is producing and communicating to her brain. In her good ear, as we call it, her left ear, she has moderate to severe hearing loss. So she really, even picking up conversational speech is a challenge for her. It's very hit or miss on what words and sounds she is hearing. Here in a little bit too, we'll talk about the impact of hearing loss at birth and how that impacts the brain's ability to interpret sound, and that's something that Josie struggles with. And we'll get into more detail that in a minute on that, but it'll give you a better understanding of kind of how students are impacted of hearing loss when it occurs at birth. When we talk about the hearing process, there's actually a lot of steps that go into our brain and ears, taking in sound waves, having those sound waves that are just vibrations in the air, and having the physical part of the ear pick up those sound waves, transferring those sound waves through the cochlear nerve and into the brain where it's interpreted as sound. So one of the things that we look at in terms of understanding hearing loss is really understanding the structure of the ear. There are several things that can occur within the structure of the ear that impact hearing. One of those is having some kind of injury to the cochlea itself. So that nerve, sometimes that nerve doesn't develop properly in utero, and there's some kind of damage that occurs to it, which prevents sound from being interpreted by the cochlea. The other thing that we oftentimes, especially our really young students, we can see they have an issue sometimes within the echinacea tubes that run to the ear, and that's when we'll see oftentimes kids get ear tubes that help that echinacea tube drain. But until they get those tubes, oftentimes the sound to them is muffled, may sound like they're underwater, and we see some language delays with students who have frequent ear infections and have that impacted by those echinacea tubes not working properly. In Josie's situation, she had an issue with the vestibular aqueduct, which is the large purple area that you see there within the ear. In hers, it's very enlarged in her right ear where she has no sound. And then she also does not have any of the hair cells within that ear that allow the ear to pick up on those sound waves. So that's really impacted for her. That impacts her hearing, but it also impacts her balance, because that vestibular aqueduct really helps us in terms of balance and coordination. So we see some pretty consistent issues with balance, with falling easily, also can contribute to frequent injuries from falling. So that's something else that sometimes we can see with students with hearing loss. When we look at some of the characteristics of the students that we work with hearing loss, most of the time we are going to see some kind of delay in language and development, either within speech development and oral language, or within the understanding of the English language. And when I say the English language, that means in terms of reading and writing in English. And most of the time, the reason we see that delay is because students don't have access to speech and English because of their hearing loss at a young age. So it really sets them up for a delay in language development. And students have a lot of different options in terms of communication. We have oral communication, where they're only speaking by voice. And then we have manual communication. So you may have students with hearing loss that use some kind of sign language or finger spelling, or they may use the official language of the deaf community, which is American Sign Language. Or at times you may see a manually coded English where they're signing something like exact English, but it's not in the same language area as American Sign Language. One of the big things I think to realize with our students with hearing loss is having access to language as soon as possible is critical. Even for my family, we are a hearing family. We have no one in our family who is deaf. And so when Josie was born and identified as having significant hearing loss by failing her hearing screening at birth, it was a challenge for us to provide her with a rich language experience, because in our home, the language that she had access to, which was speech, was not a rich language environment for her. What she needed was a really rich language environment in American Sign Language, and that was something that we had to learn along with her, but that also really developed for her a language delay. And so I think that's just really important for us to think about as we're working with these students with hearing loss. I always like to use the example of our two boys. When we're in the car and I see something interesting that they may be interested in, like a fire truck's coming down the road, and we talk about where's that fire truck maybe going, what does it do? All of that is language that they're picking up just naturally within the conversations that happen in our home. If I am not signing that same information as I'm driving, Josie is missing out on that language development. So that occurs throughout the entire day, whether it's at school and she's not getting sign language, or even through interactions with social peers, not having that access to sign language if they're speaking. In our home, conversations that we're having, if we're not signing everything that we are talking about, she's missing out on that language development. So it's just a really critical thing to understand for our students with hearing loss, that there's going to be some gaps in there in terms of language development. When we talk about manual alphabet here, we're just talking about finger spelling with our hands and what that would look like in American Sign Language. There's a hand shape is what it's called for every letter. So A, B, D. Okay, so there's just a hand shape is what we call it for each letter. That's signing the manual alphabet. It's a pretty rudimentary way of having language, but it does give some language to a person who has hearing loss. When we look at academic achievement for our students with hearing loss, research really paints two different pictures for us on what this looks like. One of the most interesting points I think it makes in the book is that students who are hard of hearing are among the least appropriately served group. This is one of the hardest groups for us to meet the needs of in public schools. And that really happens for a couple reasons. One is that significant language delay. The other is that most of the people in the school building are not using the language that the student uses, if they use American Sign Language, or they're just getting gaps because of that hearing loss within their language development. The other thing that we know about our education curriculum as a whole is it's very language-based, communication-heavy. And so having a very strong language-based curriculum and having a student who has a language delay can really create a gap that we see in student academic achievement. The other thing that we are seeing also is a number of students increasing that have hearing loss from diverse backgrounds. For example, from families whose primary language in the home is Spanish. We're seeing an increased number of those students. And those students have really unique needs, not only as a student with hearing loss, but also as a student who's maybe learning English as a second language as well. So really creating some language gaps that we have to address in the classroom. When we look at social and emotional development, we can also see some barriers that exist here because of the student's ability to communicate. When we look at the student's social and emotional development, there's really four things that play into that development. The first is the parent-child interaction. When you look at the example I talk about with our family, with my husband Chad and myself, developing that relationship with Josie from day one, we had to learn a new language to be able to do that. Now, she knew that we met her needs physically. When she was hungry or she needed a new diaper, we were able to really meet those needs immediately. But for that interaction with her to learn how to sign and to teach her to sign so that she could communicate, we were delayed in that compared to if she had been born in a deaf family where that was a natural form of communication already. So it does impact her development. I don't like to say that as a parent because I want to say, I met all of her needs, but that was just the reality, was that we were learning a new language with her, and that impacted her development. The other factor that really affects development is peers and teachers, so having interactions with them. For Josie, right now, she has been at the Kansas School for the Deaf since she was 3 years old. So they were naturally using the language that she was using. She developed those peer-teacher relationships very easily. Now we're doing some dual placement. So she's going to our neighborhood building for a really brief part of the day just to get some additional academic supports, but also really learn how to function in a hearing world. And so those peer and teacher relationships and that development, it's more challenging because they don't naturally use her language, and all the communication goes through an interpreter. So it's just something to be mindful of, especially if you have a student who is mainstreamed with hearing loss that doesn't have that community around them that speaks the same language. It's just something to be aware of as you look at their social emotional development. Because what that does is that really increases these last two things that they talk about in the book. Understanding social cues. So really getting that really natural learning experiences of social cues. If you're in a mainstream environment where you're struggling to hear what everyone is saying and you have some communication barriers, it's harder to learn those social cues. The other thing that, we always debate and worry about with Josie is when she's in our neighborhood building, does she have that sense of isolation? Does she feel like she's the only one, and she is, who is deaf and doesn't have those strong relationships because of that? So that's always something that is important to keep in mind. It's also something that as a team, when you're looking at placement, to consider. When we look at determining the causes, deafness congenital present at birth, again, remember earlier in the chapter talked about that was somewhat rare that occurred. There are some genetic causes to deafness, and a number of kids that Josie goes to school with at the Kansas School for the Deaf who are in deaf families have a genetic cause within their family for their deafness. Some of the prenatal causes that can occur, premature infants are more likely to have hearing loss because that is still developing before they're born, and we can see some ramifications of being born early. Hypoxia, lack of oxygen, can impact hearing. Also rubella and some things like that can impact. When we look at postnatal causes, we talked a little bit about ear infections. That can impact hearing and can cause some hearing loss. Typically, those students that have reoccurring ear infections and have hearing loss with that, we will see that resolve as they get ear tubes and their hearing improves drastically. The other thing we can see is bacterial meningitis can be a postnatal cause for hearing loss, and every once in a while you will see that in schools. And then postlingual causes means causes of hearing loss after language has been developed. So after students have learned to speak, we may have some injuries to the ear. For example, a trauma to the skull that could impact that, or excessive noise. For example, my father-in-law worked in the railroad industry his entire life, retired from Union Pacific, was around excessive noise most of the time during his work day. He has a lot of hearing loss just because of the damage that excessive noise caused to his hearing. So these give you some kind of determining causes for hearing loss as you're working with students, kind of getting some background on them. When we look at evaluating students with hearing loss, one of the big diagnostic assessments that we use, especially at birth, is that screening that all newborns receive. And they typically receive that before the first month of age. And then what we see is if a child fails, a newborn fails their hearing screening, they are moved on to an evaluation period that occurs before 3 months to determine the extent of that hearing loss and really get early intervention started. It's one of the most important things for these students is to have early intervention with language. Now, I will say one of the most controversial things within the deaf community is having a newborn diagnosed with deafness and not having intervention specialists or hospitals recommending sign language as a form of communication. For us, that was something that we just stumbled upon. It wasn't recommended to us, even though Josie had really significant hearing loss. And that is one thing I do regret during that first year, that we didn't spend more time working on sign language with Josie. Now, we had a number of other issues going on with her health-wise and medically, and it was a pretty challenging time. But it would have been helpful to have an early interventionist suggesting to us, hey, she has really profound loss in one ear, moderate to severe in the other ear. We really need to give her some form of communication right now. Even if she's going to talk at a later date, it's still beneficial for her to have language development occurring right now. So let's work on sign. It's always really important to provide those options. One of the diagnostic assessments that they will use after a newborn has failed their hearing screening is called an ABR, and it evaluates the brain's response to sound. And this is done typically early in age. Josie had hers, I think, at about the 2-month mark. And you have to do it while they're sleeping. And then we have had subsequent ABRs done when she's been in the operating room for something else anyway. While she's under anesthesia, they'll do an ABR just to evaluate kind of where her hearing loss is and see if we've had additional hearing loss. But I still remember doing that first ABR and sitting there with her in a chair, and she had some sensors on her head, and they were playing sound through these headphones, and she was asleep. She was sleeping very well. And I remember hearing the sound on her right ear. I could hear it through the headphones. It was very loud, and she wasn't budging at all. I could tell she could not hear it at all. And that, I think, for me was the first time I realized how significant her hearing loss was. But one of the things they do after they evaluate students for hearing loss and really determine where their hearing is at is then they begin to provide some suggestions on how to aid their hearing, either through hearing aids or cochlear implants. For Josie, she had a lot of issues with her ears, just her ears being healthy. We had lots of ear infections. We had a lot of sensory issues. Hearing aids were not something that we could do for her. It just wasn't successful with her. And now we've kind of given it to her as a choice. She decides if she wants to wear a hearing aid or not, and she chooses to not have sound. She would prefer to not have any sound, and so she doesn't currently wear hearing aids. Now, for her, she's not a good candidate for a cochlear implant because her ear that has profound loss does not have the cochlea in the correct location. It just wouldn't work for a cochlear implant. Her ear that has moderate hearing loss, the trick with the cochlear implant is that they cut the cochlea, and so she will have no natural hearing in that ear if we did cochlear implants. And so for us, we have not been willing to take that step yet until the hearing loss in the left ear maybe gets a little bit more challenging for her. The other thing I will say about cochlear implants, are a little bit controversial within the deaf community because they don't see their hearing loss as an impairment. And if it's not an impairment, it's nothing that needs to be fixed. So the cochlear implant's kind of looked at as a fix that's not necessary. And the cochlear implant is not a simple fix either. I will say that students that get cochlear implants have to go through a training process and a therapy process to train their brain on how to interpret that sound and how to work with the cochlear. I've seen lots of students who are really successful with cochlear implants. Some parents decide to do it early on and get those cochlear implants inserted at a really young age. Some parents wait and allow their child to make the decision on if they want to have the cochlear implant. It's just all up to the individual person. But I will say in the deaf community there is some particular views about the cochlear implant that's just helpful for you to be aware of if you work with a child that has hearing loss whose parents are also deaf. It's just good to kind of know those norms within the deaf community. Within the school, we test hearing each year, as you know, so we do that through audiometer, audiogram. Sometimes they will do a tympanography, which they're just checking the function of the ear and putting air through to see how it's working. And then a speech assessment and an audio brain response. That's something that's actually done at a hospital, not within the school. But when we look at kind of determining how to design instruction, we have to have a really clear picture of where the student's hearing is at and where their language skills are at. Those are the two important things as we talk about an educational evaluation. When we look at partnering for special ed and related services, there's several things that we need to consider when we look at working with students with hearing loss. The first is using an interpreter in an educational setting. This is important if we have a student who relies on sign language for their communication. It's also important, I think, early on to consider this for students with hearing loss, just to ensure that they have access to the general ed curriculum in an appropriate way. And then talking about aids and services, some of you may be familiar with FM systems or loop systems that you can use in the classroom environment to amplify sound for the student. Sometimes we'll see a teacher wear an FM system around their neck, as you see the teacher here, and then the student either wears headphones or some type of listening device. Those FM systems can also plug into hearing aids now, which is pretty slick through Bluetooth. And we know that those systems really help all students learn better when we're amplifying sound. So some classrooms now have those amplification systems where the entire class receives that amplification. The other part of assistive technology we may see for these students is closed caption technology, so ensuring that we have closed caption on any type of video that the students are watching, and some things like that are really helpful. One of the things I will say that's important to consider when we're looking at special ed and related services, OTs can be helpful, speech and language pathologists can be helpful in terms of looking at providing access to the general ed curriculum, providing supports to the classroom teacher on what would be helpful for the student with hearing loss. The other thing that's really important to remember is there is something called hearing loss fatigue, and so these students are working exponentially harder than their peers in the classroom to hear what is going on, to understand it, to interpret it, and so it's really important for us to be aware of that fatigue that can occur and building in some processes to help that student, either through some assistance with note-taking, assistance with a para, maybe an interpreter, however that looks, but just really being aware that fatigue can occur as they're trying to hear the content. And so really making accommodations and modifications as much as we can that will reduce the impact that their hearing loss has on their learning. And that's where we can kind of look at UDL design. So looking at that bilingual, bicultural model, the school that Josie goes to, the Kansas School for the Deaf, is a bilingual school. So they teach American Sign Language, and then they teach English in reading and writing. So it is considered bilingual. Her form of communication when she's expressively communicating is ASL, but she's also learning how to write in English, and she's learning how to read in English. And that's a really common model for the schools for the deaf. And I talk about schools for the deaf, but it's important to note, and the text notes this, that most students with hearing loss are going to attend public schools and be in a mainstream setting. And they're probably going to be one of very few, if not the only student with hearing loss in their building, sometimes in their district, because it is such a low percentage of students with hearing loss. So I think it's important to note that and just be aware of the concept of bilingual education for them, and making sure that through lesson planning and unit planning that we have that bilingual model for those students to access. It's also important for these students to be aware of deaf culture. If they're in a public school and mainstreamed, they're maybe not getting as much education on deaf culture as they would if they were at a school for the deaf. And so I think it's important as well for them to have the ability to access that deaf culture and learn about that as part of something that, a culture that they are a part of. When we look at effective instructional strategies, particularly for early childhood students, it's really about having a language-rich environment, however that is for that student, whether it's in ASL or whether it's aided with English. We tried to have a language-rich environment in our home as part of our early intervention process. And so we had signs, little pictures of someone signing the name of something with the word on it labeled throughout our house. So for example, at the door to our garage, and we still have these on there, it has the sign for garage, but it also has signs for coat, hat, and shoes. So that we could use that as a reminder for Josie, and we could sign it with her of things that she needed before she walked out the door. Same in her room, everything is labeled, her shirts drawer, her pants drawer. All of those things are labeled with the sign and the word. So just kind of making that a language-rich environment. And that was something that we had a lot of assistance from her preschool teachers. They helped us. They came in and helped us do that, provided us with the signs to hang in the house, and it was really helpful. The other thing that you can do is shared reading. There's a shared reading project where ASL stories are read to students. I'm going to share some examples of those in the resources, but really helpful for our early childhood students to get that really strong language experience and example by watching reading in ASL. And then vocabulary development is so critical for these students. Really developing their vocabulary, getting a really good understanding of words and what words mean and how words interact in our language. Vocabulary development, especially at the early childhood level, is really just critical. So when we talk about elementary and middle school students, here we're again continuing on vocabulary development. It's also really helpful for these students to have some deaf role models and to teach them about deaf studies. So if you have a student that you're working with in the elementary middle school level who's mainstreamed, it would be helpful to kind of build some of this into the IEP, where you are providing them with some role models for deafness, whether you're connecting with the School for the Deaf, or the School for the Deaf now has video training that they're doing on ASL, so they're connecting like over Skype or some type of tool like that with schools across the state and teaching ASL to students who are hard of hearing or deaf in those other school districts, which is a really great opportunity for them to have deaf role models. And then teach about deaf studies, so talking about the deaf culture and learning some lessons about the deaf culture is really important for these students. When we talk about post-secondary education, transition planning, those kinds of things, augmented input, we're already starting to work on some of those things with Josie, and some of that transition planning is even occurring now, even though she's in 3rd grade. One of the reasons that we have her in a mainstreamed setting for part of her day is because we're kind of building some skills that she's going to need for post-secondary education. We want her to be able to use an interpreter successfully in a classroom environment where she's learning. That's a skill she has to learn how to do. It would be harder for her to go from the School for the Deaf, where everyone in her environment is signing, including her teachers, and then go to some kind of post-secondary setting where everyone's hearing and she's getting all of her input from an interpreter. So we want her to have experiences with an interpreter before she gets to that step. So that's an important part for her of transition planning. It's not easy to do that. She doesn't really want to be at the mainstream building. She wants to be at the School for the Deaf all day. But we kind of have to weigh those experiences and what's important for her in the long run. We want her to have that community feeling with other people who are deaf, and that language immersion is really important for her for most of her day. But we also are aware that as an adult, she's going to be interacting mostly in the hearing world, and so she needs to have a skill set of interacting in the hearing world as well. So that's just a part of that transition planning that we look at. Some of the things you can do in transition planning is doing some job coaching, working on using an interpreter. It's such an important skill, and it's something you really have to learn how to do. That's helpful. Working on some kind of augmentative communication if that's necessary for that student. So Josie has an iPad she can communicate with hearing people who don't know sign. That's another kind of piece for us of transition planning for her later down the line. So I want to just point out some resources too. I'm going to link to some free ASL learning tools within the module. Also link to some ASL stories that might be effective for you to use with students with hearing loss. Again, this is a group of students that we don't see a lot because the percentage of students with hearing impairments is so small. So I think it's really important for you to have a base understanding of what it looks like to work with students with hearing impairments, the characteristics they have, but also have some resources you can go to as you get a student with a hearing impairment on your caseload, and then you can reach out to for assistance. So take a look at those resources within the module. Watch the video of the adults talking about their experience at a school for the deaf and why it was important for them. And then you'll have some chapter questions to answer as well. And again, don't hesitate to reach out if you have some questions, if you work with a student with a hearing impairment. If a year from now and you're done with this class and you end up having a student with a hearing impairment on your caseload and you're not sure what to do, reach out to me. I'm always glad to be a resource in that situation, be glad to help you.